shrines in Europe, scrubbed dishes in a hillside monastery kitchen, and told no one who he was. He had already memorized nearly the entire Bible. He had begged his superiors to send him to Africa to die as a martyr, and failed even at that. He hid his own education so completely that the men who lived beside him thought he was simple. Within a single year, an accident, a scheduling mix-up nobody planned, would drag him out of that kitchen and put him in front of a congregation with no warning at all. What came out of his mouth that day would make him the most sought-after preacher in Europe. A man crowds of 30,000 would wait all night in open fields to hear. A man remembered 800 years later as the Hammer of Heretics and the finder of everything lost. He built his entire life around one warning, that words without action are worthless. History would remember him for nothing but his words. This isn't a story about a gifted man discovered. It's the story of a man who buried his own gift on purpose, and what God did when he dug it back up. Chapter 1. The Canon who could not sit still. Lisbon, in the year 1195, was a city still learning how to be Christian again. It had been a Muslim stronghold for 4 centuries before the Crusaders took it back, and the walls still remembered both prayers. Into a noble household in that city, a boy was baptized Fernando Martins de Boulogne. He wanted for nothing. His family had standing at court. The cathedral school gave him the finest education the city could offer. By every measure that Lisbon used to count a man's worth, Fernando had already won. It wasn't enough. At 15, he did something his family did not expect. He walked away from all of it and asked to be received into the canons regular of St. Augustine at the Abbey of San Vicente, just outside the city walls. A house of prayer, of silence, of scripture, copied by candlelight. He wanted distance from the world he'd been born into. He didn't get it. His old friends from court kept visiting, pulling him back into the conversations, the politics, the noise he had tried to leave behind. So 2 years in, Fernando asked for something more drastic, a transfer to the mother house at Coimbra, further from Lisbon, further from everyone who knew his name. There, finally, the noise stopped. For 9 years he studied theology, the church fathers, scripture, until he had swallowed it whole. He became, by every account, one of the best-read young clerics in Portugal. And still, something was missing. He had traded a comfortable life for a devout one, and it wasn't enough either. Fernando was a man who kept walking toward the edge of his own life, waiting to find out what was on the other side of it. He didn't know yet, but he was about to find out. Chapter 2. The Bodies That Came Home. In January of 1220, 5 Franciscan friars were executed in Morocco. They had gone to preach Christ in a Muslim court and refused to stop when ordered to. Their remains were carried back across the sea to Portugal, to Coimbra, to the very town where Fernando had buried himself in study, and given a martyr's welcome. He was there. He watched 5 broken bodies carried through the streets he'd walked for 9 quiet years, and something in him that had been waiting finally answered. It wasn't admiration. It was recognition. These were not men who had written about faith. They had spent it completely, without holding anything back, and it had cost them everything. Fernando had years of theology in his head, and nothing in his hands to show for it. He wanted what they had. He went to the Franciscans, the same order the martyrs belonged to, and asked to join. His Augustinian brothers thought he'd lost his mind. He was leaving a respected, established order for a small band of barefoot preachers who owned nothing. He didn't care. He took the habit, and he took a new name, Anthony. He asked his new superiors for one thing: send me to Africa. Send me to preach where those 5 men died. If God wanted a 6th martyr, he intended to be ready. He would spend the rest of his life proving that faith wasn't a subject to be mastered. It was something you gave away with your hands, not just your words. He hadn't said that yet. He was already living it. Chapter 3. What God Does with a Broken Plan. Episode 1. The Martyrdom That Never Came. Anthony sailed for Morocco within the year, ready to die. Instead, he nearly did. Not by the sword, but by fever. He collapsed almost as soon as he arrived, wasted by illness for months, unable even to preach a single sermon to the people he'd crossed the sea to reach. His superiors had no choice. They put him on a ship home. The ship never made it to Portugal. A storm caught it off course and drove it east instead, towards Sicily. Anthony washed up in Italy, broke, sick, unknown, and further from his dream of martyrdom than he had ever been. The plan he had built his entire new life around had failed completely. Episode 2. The Man Who Hid in a Kitchen. With nowhere else to go, Anthony made his way to a small Franciscan gathering at Assisi, the famous chapter of Matt's, where Francis himself was present, among thousands of friars sleeping under woven shelters in the fields. Anthony was nobody there. No title, no mission, no story anyone wanted to hear. He was quietly assigned to a hermitage on a hillside near Forlì, a remote outpost with a handful of brothers. He told them almost nothing about himself. Not the years of theological study at Coimbra, not the scripture he had memorized cover to cover. He asked only for the lowest work in the house: cooking, cleaning, washing dishes for the other friars. And he did it, by every account, without complaint, for well over a year. A man who had once been counted among the finest minds in Portugal disappeared into a scullery on purpose and let everyone believe that was all he was. Episode 3. The Sermon Nobody Planned. In September of 1222, Forlì held an ordination, a solemn mass where new priests would be presented and a homily delivered. It should have been simple. Except in the confusion of the day, nobody had been assigned to preach. The Dominicans present assumed the Franciscans would provide the speaker. The Franciscans assumed the same of the Dominicans. The hour arrived, and the pulpit stood empty. Someone remembered the quiet dishwasher from the hermitage, the one who was, by rumour, supposed to know something about scripture. Anthony refused at first. He said he wasn't prepared, that he had nothing ready, that they should ask someone else. There was no one else. Reluctantly, humiliated by the request itself, he climbed into the pulpit with no notes and no warning. What came out of him stunned the room into silence. Clear, commanding, soaked in scripture he'd spent 9 hidden years absorbing. The kind of preaching that didn't sound rehearsed because it wasn't. It sounded like a man who had simply been waiting his whole life to be asked. Word reached Francis of Assisi himself within months. Francis, a man famously suspicious of proud, over-educated preachers, took the almost unheard-of step of personally authorizing Anthony to teach theology to the friars. On one condition: that study never crowd out prayer. The kitchen years were over. Episode 4. The Hammer of Heretics. From Forlì, Anthony was sent where the church needed its sharpest voice, into the heart of Cathar, an Albigensian territory across northern Italy and southern France, where entire towns had drifted from orthodox Christian teaching. He preached in market squares, in cathedrals, in fields when the churches couldn't hold the crowds. He didn't flatter his listeners. He confronted them, plainly and without cruelty, and people who had mocked him at the start of a sermon were often in tears by the end of it. It was during these years, tradition holds, that he travelled to the seaside town of Rimini, where the local heretics refused even to let him speak. According to the account passed down in Franciscan memory, Anthony walked to the riverbank alone and began to preach instead to the fish gathering at the water's edge, declaring that if the people of Rimini would not hear the gospel, God's own creatures would. Word of it spread through the town, and crowds, heretics among them, came running to see what was happening. Whatever actually occurred on that riverbank, the story took hold immediately and never let go. Even Anthony's own contemporaries were already repeating it before his death. It earned him a nickname that followed him the rest of his life, the Hammer of Heretics. The dishwasher was gone completely now. In his place stood the most talked about preacher in Italy, and the hardest years of his life were still ahead of him. Chapter 4. The Last Lent. By 1231, Anthony had settled in Padua, a city he'd grown to love, founding a small Franciscan house and giving himself to the poor and the forgotten there with the same intensity he gave the pulpit. That final Lent, he preached every single day. The crowds that came to hear him were no longer hundreds, they were thousands, sometimes reported as high as 30,000 people in a single gathering, far more than any church in the city could hold. He preached in open piazzas and fields instead, with people arriving the night before just to secure a place close enough to hear him. It cost him something the crowds never saw. After each morning sermon, Anthony would sit for confession, not for an hour, not for two, but for the entire remainder of the day, hearing the confessions of anyone who came, refusing to turn people away, even as his own strength gave out. Admirers pressed in so close, so eager for a piece of the man they believed was a living saint, that friars had to physically guard him from people trying to cut fragments of his habit away as relics while he preached. He had spent his whole life insisting that faith wasn't real until it was spent, that the words a man said meant nothing next to what his hands actually did. In one of the sermons that survives from these years, in his own words, he put it as plainly as he ever would. Actions speak louder than words. Let your words teach, and your actions speak. By the end of that Lent, there was no space left between the two. His body was the proof of his own sermon. It broke him, weakened by illness and by a season of preaching and fasting that would have exhausted a much younger, much healthier man. Anthony withdrew with two of his brothers to a quiet retreat outside the city at Campo San Piero, hoping rest might restore him. He asked for a simple shelter to be built into the branches of a walnut tree, where he could sit above the ground in prayer and speak with the country people who came looking for him. It was there, tradition holds, that he experienced a vision of the Christ child appearing to him in the branches, a moment that would come to define how the world pictured him for the next 800 years. In painting after painting, statue after statue, whatever passed between Anthony and heaven in that walnut tree, he came down from it, a man who knew his time was almost finished. On the 13th of June, weeks after arriving at Campo San Piero, Anthony felt death closing in and asked to be carried home to Padua, the city he had come to love as his own. The wagon never made it. Outside the city walls, at a small friary in Arcella, his companions realized he could go no further, and they stopped. He lay among friars who had traveled with him through the hardest years of his ministry. As the end came, one of them noticed Anthony, staring fixed and silent toward the ceiling, and asked gently what he saw. "I see my Lord," he answered. He was 36 years old. Chapter 5. What outlived him? Word of Anthony's death moved through Padua before his body did. Children in the streets were already crying out that the saint is dead before the church had said a single official word. Rome didn't take long to agree. Less than a year later, May 30th, 1232, Pope Gregory IX declared Anthony a saint, one of the fastest canonizations in the entire history of the Church, a recognition of a reputation the ordinary people of Italy had already given him themselves. A basilica rose in Padua to hold what remained of him, a building so central to the city's identity that locals still call it simply Il Santo, the saint, no last name required. Centuries later, in 1946, the church looked back at the body of sermons Anthony had left behind, dense with scripture, clear enough for ordinary people to carry home and live by, and gave him a title reserved for only a handful of Christian teachers across 2,000 years, Doctor of the Church. The boy who once buried his own theological training in a monastery kitchen became one of the most trusted teachers Christianity has ever produced, and the trait that made him famous in his own lifetime followed him into legend too. Long after his death, a stolen prayer book belonging to Anthony was said to have been returned, unharmed, after prayers were offered for its recovery. And from that story grew a devotion practiced by millions of ordinary Christians today whenever something precious goes missing. A quiet request to the man once known simply as the finder of lost things. He never got the martyrdom he sailed to Africa hoping for. He got something he never asked for instead. A voice that outlasted his body by 8 centuries. He spent years hiding a gift he was afraid to use, convinced no one needed to hear from him. Whatever you've buried out of fear or false humility, your voice, your calling, the thing you keep telling yourself isn't ready yet. It might be closer to the surface than you think. History forgot them, but they were faithful. And now, it's our turn to remember. Subscribe to Forgotten Heroes of Faith